Hi, my name is Sam Led, and welcome to The Fearless Now. This is for you in the nosebleed seats, if you're looking for an easier way to approach anxiety, stress, and unhealthy habits from the inside out. There's no techniques and no strategies, so sit back, relax, and let me be your peace of mind Uber driver, here on The Fearless Now. Welcome to The Fearless Now podcast. My name is Sam Led. I'm a transformational coach, and this is episode number 21. This podcast is for you in the nosebleed seats and made possible by you. It's an honor and a privilege to be here as always. And I'm just coming off the high of being a guest on the Bobby Kudo show. If you haven't heard of Bobby Kudo, he has an amazing podcast, really great guy. He really covers some amazing content. He could be like the Boston version of This American Life. I forgot the name of the guy who did that program, but the program on NPR, This American Life. Well, Bobby Kudo's the Boston version. He's real. He's authentic. He's got some great things to say. He's also an incredible human being. Go check out the Bobby Kudo show. Hey, Bobby. Anyways, in today's episode, I want to talk about ADHD and hypersensitivity. You could call it emotional hypersensitivity. And those of us that are ADHDers are very familiar with this, for better or for worse. And I'm going to talk about emotional hypersensitivity within the realm of the three principles and the inside-out understanding that was discovered by this brilliant Scottish mystic. I love saying that, this Scottish mystic named Sydney Banks, who came upon one day, just had this amazing epiphany. Like all great sages, all great prophets, all great thought leaders and thinkers, that we are not our thinking. It's an illusion. It's made up, that we have this supercomputer doing its best to keep us safe, and it's going to create all kinds of nonsense to keep us in the game of life. But we realize that we're in the game of life, whether our brain is trying to keep us safe or not. And of course, our supercomputer, our brain is perfectly imperfect. Anyways, I want to really kind of dive into attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and emotional hypersensitivity. ADHD is a human-made construct that is a label that the psychologists and other clinicians use to diagnose. So they can put that CPT code on the insurance sheet so they can get reimbursed. But it's really not all that. It's more than that. But realizing the ADHD is a made-up label that identifies with a cluster of behaviors or thought processes that people have, like I do and other ADHDers have, that have brought confusion and disruption and sometimes suffering in our lives. But we are looking at it the wrong way. And again, I'm not a medical professional. I don't claim to, if you really have a struggle with ADHD or anything like that, go to your therapist, go to your psychologist, go to your medical professional. I'm not an expert in that, but I can only speak from my experience and what my heart tells me and what my experience with my clients. So knowing that ADHD is a man-made descriptor that is categorized by certain types of behaviors and thought processes that at times can be really troubling in the individual who is suffering from this man-made, made-up condition or disorder, as the DSM and clinicians call it. Maybe we're looking at ADHD, especially ADHD and emotional hypersensitivity, the wrong way. Because if you can look at ADHD, and bear with me, for those of you that just started listening to my podcast, the bevy of my work, my coaching work, is based on the principles of mind, thought, and consciousness discovered by this Scottish mystic, this everyday man named Sydney Banks, who, like all great sages, like all great prophets, like all great thinkers and writers and people out there that have really made their mark in the world, he was really curious about why he was feeling crappy about his life and why he was in a bad mood all the time, why he was emotionally reactive all the time. And then he woke up one day and he's like, oh shit, I'm quiet right now. I'm not in my thinking. Maybe it's all made up. Maybe it's all thought that's made up by this brain, that we're more than our brain, than our intellectualized, ego-driven malarkey, that there's a lot more to it. And so looking at ADHD as a cluster of behaviors or thought processes or cognitive processes that are sometimes not working for us. From the inside out, would say, well, you have a neurotype that is brilliant, but it's different. ADHD could be a neurotype. We don't look at it as a neurotype. We look at it as a disorder or something wrong with you. There's a deficiency in dopamine, or our body's metabolizing dopamine and certain neurochemicals, which makes us forgetful and overstimulated. And we're going to talk about hypersensitivity. It makes us forget things, and we're impulsive, and we have 70 windows open all at once. We can't focus, and we're easily distracted. I can go on and on and on. So if we can look at ADHD as a neurotype, that it's not a disorder. We're not disordered. We're not attention deficit. We're just attention different. And there's a big difference there. That maybe ADHD is a special neurotype. Maybe there's nothing wrong with us. Our brains just work differently. That we have this brilliant supercomputer of our brain that is like, let me compare this to, and it's so shallow, but let me compare this to like a high revving, very sophisticated, high performance sports car, F1 car engine, right? It needs a little bit more attention, but when it's working in top order, when it's working the way it's intended to, it can do anything. It can win all the races. And some of the greatest, most successful, most brilliant people out there in the world have been diagnosed with ADHD. And because of ADHD, as maybe it's not a disorder, but maybe it's a superpower, but just the world just doesn't understand us because our perception and the way we see the world maybe just be a little different. Kind of like some forms of autism. They look at that as a different neurotype. ADHD, to me, from where I'm sitting, it's a neurotype. It's not a disorder. It's not a dysfunction. We don't need to fix anything. We can strengthen certain areas that we need some help with. But if we're looking at it from the inside out, when we see that we are beyond our thinking, that we are not the sum total of our thoughts, that thought and thinking is this illusory, as we go along in our life, minute by minute process, the brain's just spitting out all kinds of thought, all kinds of thinking, all kinds of stuff that A, is trying to inform us of the world around us, and B, is trying to keep us safe. And we know that B, thinking can never keep us safe. It's impossible. So let me get back to ADHD. I'm going off on a tangent here. So why are people with ADHD, some of them, not every person with ADHD has the same stuff. I'm not going to call it symptoms. I'm just going to say every ADHD brain is different. But the interesting thing is that my friends and I growing up, and my colleagues in my professional career that have ADHD, we all, and it's interesting because I thought, it was just maybe my upbringing, or perhaps it's just my personality. We're a little bit emotionally hypersensitive. Why are we hypersensitive? Who cares? It's our neurotype. And maybe our hypersensitivity is also wrapped in old conditioning or habitual thought that has never been examined. But it doesn't really matter. What does emotional hypersensitivity look like? Well, we get emotional too easy. Sometimes we might cry too easily. Clinicians and psychologists and other mental health professionals really define that as the ability to regulate emotions. And the ability to regulate emotions in the ADHD brain is a lot different. We could also say there may be deficient amounts of certain neurochemicals like dopamine, like our brain is metabolizing dopamine. Or that's just how our brain works. That is just our neurotype. Our brain does things a certain way, innocently. And the interesting thing about emotional hypersensitivity is that we don't behave that way all the time. We don't overreact all the time, us ADHDers. And I'll give you a great example. Growing up, I had a really good friend in high school, very close friend of mine. We shared many classes together, and we both had ADHD. I wasn't diagnosed at the time, and I don't know if he was or not, but it was very obvious. And that's okay, right? And so I remember I would say something, I would interrupt somebody in class, or I don't know, something would trip him off, something that I would say, and he would overreact. He would scream and yell at me. And then when he would say something that would piss me off, I would do the same thing. And it was like step and fetch it, going back and forth with each other. And the interesting thing is that after school, we'd be hanging out with other friends, and him and I would be like best buds. We'd be calm. We would be just ourselves. We weren't caught up in our head. We weren't caught up in our thinking. We weren't behaving and overreacting about stuff that we were doing to each other. So we don't have emotional hypersensitivity all the time with ADHD. That's the beauty of it, because the ADHD mind can be your best friend or your worst enemy. And once you see that the ability to regulate emotions in the ADHD brain is different, that even who cares if our brain is metabolizing dopamine too quickly or whatever neurochemicals is causing this. Because in areas that we don't do as well in, or let me rephrase that, areas that we just behave differently in than the other neurotypes in the world, right? Because I would say ADHD is a neurotype. So perhaps it's the way we just see things and how our brain processes things that are different. And sometimes we overreact. And it could be, I remember I had a friend who also had ADHD, and he found out they changed the taste of Coca-Cola. We were like in 5th grade, and he started to cry and get really upset. It was a little over the top, and he was ADHD and diagnosed with it later on. But maybe our brain just works differently. And personally, and I've shared this with other fellow ADHDers, friends, and colleagues. I love experiencing strong emotions. I love hanging out with other ADHD brains. I love getting excited easily. That's just who I am. Because people with ADHD, we're passionate, we're interesting, we're really expressive people. We get involved for careers in being professional podcasters or politicians or lawyers or educators or you name it. The ADHD conundrum is not a conundrum. Can be a superpower if we can look at when we get wrapped up around the axle too quickly and we get hyperreactive and we kind of can be hyper impulsive and see that for what it is. It's still the brain doing the thought thinking dance, whether there's not enough neurochemicals or not. So get curious about it. If you have ADHD and you have a friend has ADHD or you have a loved one or your son or your daughter, get curious about it. How many times during the day does it happen? Just noticing it when we get caught up and we can be overreactive at times. Because we have this thing that Sydney Banks calls is our inner default state, our inner wisdom. It's not our thinking. It's not the supercomputer that glitches between our ears, that it's perfectly imperfect, that's doing the best job it can to keep us safe and to tell us stuff about the world that is not right a lot of the time. And once you see that thought thinking is illusion, once you see that we are so much more than our thinking, that our inner wisdom doesn't come from thought, it doesn't come from our brain, that our inner wisdom can point us to a solution when we listen to it. It's not upstairs in that machinery of the mind. It's a quiet voice gently nudging us, just knowing and seeing when we get caught up. And I myself, when I see it, it's just enough. Because the more we see our thinking going sideways very quickly, the more awareness we have and the more time we have to pump the brakes, the more time we have to looking to pumping the brakes and saying, oh, there goes my mind again. There goes my brain again. Oh, it's having a ADHD moment. The more present we can be, the more aware we are of when our thinking goes sideways, when we jump the gun, when we impulsively react, us ADHDers. The more awareness is to cool our jets. The more awareness it is to, hey, slow down a little bit. Where's the fire? What's the hurry about? that it's not a thing. It's a thing that ultimately we have agency over that ADHD hypersensitive reactivity sometimes. And the more we see and the more aware we are, the more we can drop into the present moment out of our thinking, out of our ADHD temporary thinking, the more we are paying attention to your innate wisdom of who you are, not the machine called the brain. but you, that divine, conscious, loving, patient, expansive you underneath all that thinking. And as woo as that sounds, and as esoteric and as supernaturally whatever it sounds, that's the truth. That an ADHD mind, just like any neurotype out there, is a sniper mind because it works really well under stress. When we have to do a million things at once, we're really good at it. We're really expressive. We're really passionate about life. We're really fun to be around. And we have great ideas. And you know what? That's what builds companies, which builds nations, creates new inventions. I mean, I'm sure half the inventors out there have ADHD. Einstein was dyslexic and had learning disabilities. The more we see that ADHD is not a disability, but it's just, you have a different way of processing stimuli, and that's okay. And just like every supercomputer of a brain that glitches, whether you have ADHD or not, being aware that a supercomputer called your brain is going to glitch from time to time, that is completely independent, it has nothing to do with your neighbor screaming at you or your boss not happy with your work or your partner upset with you. It is ultimately up to you to be really aware of how special and how capable you are underneath this illusory thing called thought and thinking, that at any time, many, many times during the day, we drop out of thought and thinking and into the present moment. You can call it mindfulness, you can call it being self-aware, but the more we do that, the more we are aware when we get hyperreactive. And us ADHDers just kind of lose our shit sometimes, right? The more we can see it, the more we get dropped into the present moment, the less of a problem it is, because it isn't a problem. I guarantee you, but we beat ourselves up about it because we see it as a frailty. And maybe it is for some of us. But just noticing it when we go sideways, when our thinking goes sideways, when we lose our shit, is enough. Without trying to fix what's not broken. Because none of you are broken. None of you are disordered or, God, there's so many. If you opened up the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, man, it's depressing to read it. It's pointing out everything that's wrong with the brain, with this, that, and the other. But when you see that a lot of it is just thought, and if we look at it from the inside out, whereas it's made up, and at any time during the day, whether you have an ADHD brain or you have a Joe Schmo brain or whatever brain you have, we all drop into that same state, that same space of presence. All of us do. And when you drop into that space of presence, that's how we build the next hydrogen-powered car. I don't know. That's how we build the next rocket ship to Mars. That's when we think of the next great American novel. So once we see that it's all illusory, our thought and thinking, that ultimately we have agency of it because it doesn't even exist. And then we see we don't need to fix anything, that we're not broken. That at any time, we can get ourselves right back on track. We can eject that floppy disk, that ADHD floppy disk, and put something else in. I hope you've enjoyed this. Hope this has been helpful. This program is made possible by all of you, you in the nosebleed seats. It's such an honor to be here for you guys. If I can get you thinking and then not get you thinking and get you dropping into the present moment and getting quiet, then I've done my job. I will see you again for another episode of The Fearless Now.